So here things get a little bit messy. So you could predict someone's behavior just by knowing them well. Does that mean they have no free will, that they couldn't potentially do otherwise?
Today's episode is about free will. Is there even a theory of everything? And the physics of idealism, that is, the notion that consciousness is fundamental and only. We also touch on interpretations of quantum mechanics, where the observer has a privileged role in creating the universe. Matt O'Dowd is a science communicator and an astrophysicist, a professor at the City University of New York, involved in gravitationally lensed quasars, which touch on the crisis in cosmology, which is something that we'll speak about in this episode and for sure in the next one at length. Matt is also the host of PBS Space Time, which has over 2 million subscribers. I think it's 2.8, and they're the largest physics and space show on YouTube. And in case you're wondering who I am, my name is Curt Jaimungal. I have a background in mathematical physics, and this channel is Theories of Everything, which is dedicated to the theoretical physics endeavor of understanding gravity and quantum field theory, but as well as we investigate consciousness and the fundamental role it may have. If you're watching this, you'll see that I'm in a...
So hi, my name's Al Cannistraro. I'm the host of this podcast called Raised Catholic. I'm going to explain up front why I call it Raised Catholic real briefly. I can't help the fact that I self-identify as a Catholic or somebody raised Catholic because that's how I was raised and that's how my worldview was framed. Even though I've largely moved on, even though people who know me might consider me an atheist, I'm actually an independent thinking, self-identified, imprinted Catholic who has his own ideas about the world and about reality. But those ideas have been shaped largely by my Catholic upbringing. I can't shake it. So now that I'm interested and finally anticipated I'm not going to be here forever, I'm trying to get some clarity by having this podcast. And what the podcast is about is one of the main tools that I use now, rather than going to church, rather than studying theology, rather than listening to the teachings of an organized religion. What I normally do now is I explore the internet for the wisdom that's out there, commonly available through things like podcasts. And my favorite podcast, or one of my favorite podcasts for this purpose, is called TOE, Theories of Everything, with Curt Jaimungal. Curt Jaimungal is a young filmmaker, a young person who has a similar interest in figuring out the answers to life's persistent questions, to borrow a phrase. And he does this through science, primarily, and philosophy. And he recently had as his guest the host of one of the most successful YouTube channels that explore the big questions scientifically, and that channel is Space Time, PBS Space Time, hosted by Matt O'Dowd. Maybe you're one of the 5 million followers of that channel. Matt O'Dowd is in New York, and he's a great science communicator. He has these episodes on YouTube, last about 20 minutes each or so, a couple of times a month. Yeah. Answers the big questions through science, great scripts, great illustrations. And he's making a documentary, where he's going to try to answer the big questions about things like the nature of reality, the meaning of things like words like meaning. He's going to be answering those questions in a movie called Inventing Reality. And that's why he was on the TOE podcast with Curt Jaimungal. So I and 2 friends will be discussing this in this episode of Raised Catholic. So my guests are Rob Stroud. Rob, would you mind saying hello and saying a few words about yourself? Rob, you're muted.
Rob, you're muted.
Now I'm muted. Yeah. So I go by the moniker of Transcendent Psychotherapist on a YouTube channel. We met through that, didn't we? And I'm just kind of interested in. I'm a psychotherapist, but I'm interested in the overlap between like psychology and spirituality, and kind of philosophy and theology, kind of all the sort of big questions, basically.
Okay.
I'm here from the UK. So yeah.
Okay, great.
Other side of the pond.
Other side of the pond, yeah, and I really appreciate your being here again. And Mark Lawton, who was a friend, who was a little bit nearer to where I am. Mark, would you say a few words about yourself?
Sure. I don't know who I am any longer, but I was a lot of things at one time. That is, I've had a lot of different experiences. I feel like I've lived, in fact, probably at least 3 different lives, and they've all been interesting. And I think where I am now is I'm in a point where I realize how little I know, and so I listen to people and talk and try to explore what they know so that I can learn something from it. That's what I do nowadays.
Great. Well, thank you very much for getting up to talk to me and Rob about this. So let's just get into it. I assume we all 3 have listened to that whole podcast, and Rob and I spoke about the first hour of that podcast when we last got together on this podcast. And now we're going to be talking about the second part. The second part is largely about free will. And I'll just say a few words about my thoughts about free will. And then we'll have, I'll get your thoughts and we'll have a discussion. And like everything else, I'm imprinted with the theological idea of free will. Going to a Catholic school, one of the big things that happens to a young Catholic is you wind up going through a process, an experience called First Communion. First Communion meaning that you're going to participate in the main devotion, the Mass, and it requires that you have a concept of responsibility. Basically, you have to have the capability of realizing when you're doing wrong, when you are doing things that are morally good versus morally bad. You have to have reached what they consider the age of reason at around 7 years old, which means that you have to be capable of feeling guilt for doing things that you realize or you believe that you should not have done. So you have to have the ability to feel guilty, have to have the ability to realize the idea that you may be punished, and you may have to be punished for that guilt, and you also can be free of guilt and therefore merit reward, the eternal economy of reward and punishment, which was a big part of the Catholic business plan. I say going forward. So you had to have the ability to know the difference between right and wrong, you had to acknowledge that you could be guilty of sin if you did wrong. That implied the ability to freely choose to do right or wrong. Therefore, it was theologically necessary that you believe in free will, that what your actions are your own responsibility, not inevitable. So it was kind of off the table to consider anything but the possibility of free will. So in that regard, free will was not something that was a yes or a no question for me. It was more of an essay question, something that you could discuss, but not something that you could actually reject if you wanted to. So that's my background in free will. I never really considered it anything but an essay question. So how about I'll ask Rob first. What were your thoughts, at least prior to watching this podcast? What were your thoughts on free will?
Yeah, so interesting topic, isn't it? I think it's there's a lot of philosophers talk about the illusion of free will. Certainly what we all definitely have is a sense that we have free will. We have that sort of hard to think that you're not making choices and making real choices. I guess the whole free will thing for me gets a little bit pulled into very limited debates between people. So you get this kind of libertarian free will versus sort of determinism. But I think there's kind of other, we perhaps need to define what we mean by free if we're going to talk about free will, and define what we mean by will as well to some extent. And if you've got a will, then you've got a disposition, haven't you, already? So if you've got a disposition, then you've got a nature, and you've got a set of things that you're more or less likely to do. If it's just completely free, then it's completely open, and it's like the roll of an infinite dice that you could just roll, and who knows where it'll turn out. So certainly that kind of randomness can't be free will. So I suppose I see free will on the lines of what I would call rational free will, which is, I suppose, closest to something like compatibilism, which kind of sort of says, well, we're free to choose to some extent from the things that we would want to do. So when I do what I want to do, then my freedom is kind of found in that. But at the same time, recognizing that, and maybe this comes back to the Catholic thing and Augustine and so on free will and original sin, human nature, and that stuff. But without accepting all of that necessarily, but still acknowledging there is an insight there into our own natures that often we want to do. We experience that every new year. We want to do it. I want to go to the gym. I want to go and do all these things, but somehow it doesn't happen. So we can intend and want to do things, but find that we have sort of weaknesses in being able to put it into action. Yeah, some of my first thoughts. I said a lot.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. I'm sure you have a lot to say about free will. What were your thoughts, at least prior to viewing Matt O'Dowd's podcast?
You mean prior to seeing the?
Yeah.
Yes. I don't think I really thought much of free will. Okay, I mean, that is, I haven't been too much worried by it because I assume that it's just part of human nature. But I really was fascinated by Dow's ideas that are based in physics and science. That is, he believes there is something in the interaction between what he calls layers of action, or layers of reality, or layers of some sort of substance stuff. I find that fascinating. I actually believe that all of reality is in a sense illusion, and I buy his idea of illusion in this sense. We make it up because we have this marvelous brain thing that has been part of our evolution. I'm very much an evolutionist, but I believe that if you back up evolution and think of free will in that sense, what you're really talking about is energy, and you're really talking about essential elements of energy. I think you have to remember that as much as physicists have played around with, it all comes down to energy which has force, which is plus or minus. And the plus and the minuses, once you get in aggregates of more than 2 or 3, become indeterminable. They become impossible to really predict in any real way. And I think that that's what, to me, is the essence of free will. It's essentially the universe, the energy of the universe, essentially being explained by our limited brain capacity to talk about the unlimited capability of choice. Now, I believe there is an unlimited capability of choice, but I don't think it has anything to do with our brain or our mind or any of that stuff. I think it has to do with the fact that the universe has its own energy force, which we are a part of the consequence of through evolution. I'm a firm believer in evolutionary, but I don't think I see it as a totally biological system. It's not a totally biological system. It's a system. You have to remember where it all comes from, and it all comes from energy forces. And I think that's to me, that's what the fundamental basis of free will is. And I think it's wonderful that both theologians, philosophers, and scientists are all trying to, in their own languages, trying to figure out what it is. And you know what? I don't think any of them have the right language to understand it. Physicists use and scientists use mathematics. Mathematics is a language. I think it's inadequate, which we've understood largely because they're dealing with quantum now. The quantum is an unfathomable thing in the sense that we do not have the tools to understand it, really. We don't have the language. We have very limited mathematics, which is all based on a logical, it's a very predetermined, and if you get outside of that predetermined set of rules or axioms, I mean, even Tao talks about you have to have certain axioms. Well, no, you don't. You develop the axiom that's useful for you so that you feel satisfied with the answer. That's fine. That's okay, but it's not really the answer. I think he's more on to the truth when he starts dealing with it's really all illusion. Of course it is. It's illusion because we make it up. We have to make it up because that's our reality. We create the reality. We create the illusion that we call the reality. And I buy that. I buy that, but I don't think I buy it because of any theological, philosophical, or scientific base. I don't know what it should be, but I know it's something I don't know. Well, I know it's a little bit flaky, but that's where I am.
Well, no need to apologize. I don't think anybody really has any grounds for, even Matt O'Dowd has any grounds really saying anything definitive about free will. He's saying what satisfies him and his audience. But Rob, you have any reactions to what Mark said?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting. I think, I mean, just logically thinking around free will, I mean, the options are either as complete randomness, or there's some kind of system. Do you know what I mean? And it's difficult to know, like randomness. Let's say if each decision I make in my will is kind of just random, then like if we chose, if we all sat down and chose, for the rest of your life, all of your choices will just be chosen by a random coin flip generator machine or something, whatever. How many of us would choose to plug into that? It wouldn't be something you'd had ownership over. It would just be this kind of random that suddenly my arm will go like this, or I'll suddenly find myself poking my head down the toilet, or randomness wouldn't be freedom in that sense as well. So I think to get some sort of free will, you have to have a mixture of it, having will of what you want and what you think about, but also I think there has to be some kind of nature to it, some sort of formatting, some sort of system that can operate and that you can control, and that works along sort of rational lines. I know I want to get to X goal, and these are the things that I value. These are the things that I want to be doing. Therefore, if I choose this, will it get me more towards that, or will it get me more towards this? So. And it was interesting listening to Matt O'Dowd's ideas, because he talked about, didn't he, this like intra level between, I don't know, between like in molecules, if I understood him correctly, like quantum stuff, or maybe, and then you had saying that's separate from maybe the interlevel between, say, atoms and molecules and so on. And I'm not sure. I might have just misunderstood him. I'm not sure, but I kind of still found myself wondering. But what does that give you? How does that further the debate, really? Because I was thinking, like, is that still? I mean, all that's still got to interact in some way. Is it still ultimately kind of random, or is it still ultimately determined? But you've got these just kind of levels that are interacting in a multi-determined way. I didn't really understand how it was advancing, or what he meant thoroughly by free will either.
Well, let me just share my understanding, because I'm putting together this podcast. I've listened to that podcast a lot. Every pause, every moment of silence I've listened to, trying to understand exactly what he means. And I think the idea of the levels he's talking about reductionism. He's talking about the mechanistic view of the world. The scientific view is that there is no free will. It's just an inevitable unwinding of a clock spring, or an unwinding of a series of random events. In any case, it's not something under our control. By the time we are aware of having made a decision, well, we are the recipient of that decision, in a sense that's already been made. And talking about the levels, he's just talking about, the nature of reality, the reduced nature of reality, where everything gets reduced down to, as far as he can tell, quantum fields. That's as far down as they can go. Quantum fields to subatomic particles, to atoms, to molecules, to cells, biologically, to organs, the brains, that minds. Okay, so one thing leads to another, to another, to another, to another. One neuron fires, another fires, another fires. That's what we call the mind, and that's where choice, or the sense of having made a choice, gets made, and that's as far as the scientific view goes. So if you look at that as dogma, as scientific dogma, as I call it, then the word free will means nothing. It's just a sensation. So that's the conventional view. But then he says, when we start talking about these different levels, within each level, yeah, sure, from one level to another, things kind of unwind deterministically. But within the level, now there are games, there are rules that apply. He uses the example of fluid dynamics, which I'm not really familiar with, but that's his most common example. Fluid dynamics, Bernoulli's principles, they tell you everything you need to know about how fluids mix. So when you're talking about fluids at any level, that's what you go look at. You look at the fluid dynamics. So he says, well, look, when you get to the level of the mind, so to speak, we have psychology. Psychology uses that as its, and this is your field. Well, obviously, you know it better than I do, but the idea of the dynamics of thoughts, that's where the action happens. Okay, so no matter what you know about neurons, if you know about how thoughts work and how they interact, you can understand how decisions are made. So he says, for example, if you know somebody's personality, you know their inclinations, you can predict their behavior much more easily than if you know what the neuron firing pattern was. Okay, so that's ultimately that's his justification. He says, you know what? If you want to believe in free will, it's okay. It's your choice. You have the choice to believe in free will, making a joke, because it comes down to psychology. He doesn't use the word psychology more than a couple of times, but I think that's his big insight into free will. He says, yeah, it's okay to believe in psychology, and obviously choice is part of psychology. He doesn't really define what choice is. He assumes that choices are effective rather than be something, a sensation. So that's my understanding of his contribution. I could be wrong, but that's my best shot at that. Yeah. So I mean, I personally thought it was a very noble attempt on his part to make it okay to believe in science, to scientifically, or for a scientifically oriented person to believe that free will exists. I don't know how convincing he is to other scientists. I don't know, but that's my thought. But my big takeaway from this whole thing was, the older I get, the more failure I experience in controlling my own behavior, in a sense. The more aware I become of my repeated shortcomings in not doing what I want to do, and my bad habits, and
it's called wisdom.
It's but it's also very disheartening, because I realize I'm pitiful. I'm pitiful in so many ways. I don't really have the ability to control my behavior nearly as much as I like to think, because I always behave in the same characteristic ways, and everybody knows it. The better the people know me, the better they know it. I'm always going to behave the same way. So,
but now think of it. Think of it. It's the magic and the marvelous, the outstanding contribution that human beings make to the world and the universe. We are the only being that there is that has introspection, that essentially insists upon looking upon the motives of what if, why are we doing this? Is it right? What the hell is right or wrong? From an evolutionary point of view, there is no right or wrong. There's simply adaptation, replication, survival. That's all. I happen to, my biggest problem has been trying to figure out morality. Where does it come from? Why is it? Do we need it? Why did we develop it? And how do we secure it if we think it's useful for survival? And I think the very thing you're talking about is marvelous, in the sense of it expresses the essence of what the beings we are. Now, I think that Dowd, I love scientists because they need systems. They are locked into mathematical formulations. It results in some marvelous and phenomenal consequences, which help make our lives better in most cases. But you look at even, I mean, we just went through a whole terrible period of trying to deal with Noam Chomsky in the other group that were looking at his book. And what I got out of it was that what Noam Chomsky has been doing is so unsettling to us, because we know that he's pointing out all of the problems that are a consequence of our actions and inactions. Now, you can't sort that out easily by science, and Dowd tries to. I mean, I think his layering idea, I don't think he has an appreciation very much for the energy essence. He sort of dismissed the string theory. I wouldn't dismiss it. I'd say, well, we don't know enough to know what it really means, because we have not really gotten to the essence of what makes for things. We don't know yet. I mean, he talks about, think about neurons. He talks about neurons moving, I mean, as if it moves plus or minus. What is the plus or minus? The plus or minus it's an energy field. It's an energy field that has a consequence, which we've used, or we've inadvertently used, to develop intelligence, to develop knowledge, to develop systems, to develop a method for making it possible to live in this environment, which is chaotic as all hell. You know, the universe is chaotic. It's not well organized. All right. And we've had as a species to figure out, how do we make it useful for ourselves, for our survival? And we've done marvelously well in it. All right. Many ways we've screwed it up badly, but hey, nothing is perfect. I don't think anything's perfect. Things are always in process. And I essentially think that what he calls I mean, I call it chaos. I have no problem with chaos, because I think chaos is at the essence of what matter is, and what
he calls random. Were you looking for random?
Well, he talks about random. It's not random. Random requires you to understand what's not random. What not random is, you can count in number systems. You can use mathematics to solve this. I think we cannot solve the consciousness and solve the problem, what we think of as a problem of really understanding thinking, and I mean, it could be free will, whatever it is, because we're looking to encapsulate it into a logical mathematical system. You know what? You can't do it. We don't have the right language. We don't have the tools. We don't have the capability yet to do it. Now, maybe we'll evolve to a point where the neurons will evolve differently. But don't forget, neurons are not fixed things. They are also evolving. They are also changing according to the environments they're in, that they need to adapt to, sufficient to survive, sufficient to replicate, sufficient to maybe flourish. But flourishing is a whole different issue.
Let's give Rob a chance to weigh in.
Okay.
Thank you.
Gosh, we're covering a lot of different. We opened a lot of tins there. Yeah, we sort of touched on morality, didn't we? Which is, I think, is interesting, because I was talking about, making the choices and not always making the choices. It sounds like that you want to make, and get kind of how our own nature kind of trips us up sometimes from our ideals and all those sort of things. I suppose also it then raises the question of reductionism, basically, because is morality, so reductionism, or I think, or you can always have reductionism always works on the basis of having a kind of sentence that says nothing but. So I call it nothing butism. So morality, for example, if you, so that reductionism kind of said, like, psychology is really just kind of emergent biology. Biology is nothing but emergent physics. Chemistry, chemistry is nothing but emergent physics, etc., etc. And ultimately, everything's just like an energy soup, and it's just kind of gone this route, But with morality, it's like you then end up with, like, say, evolutionary psychology, some of the criticism around evolutionary psychology is that it does that kind of nothing butism. So you look at the love that a mother has for the child, and it's like, well, it's nothing but survival value, that, you know, and it therefore kind of then dismisses away that the love is something valuable, meaningful in itself. You know, everything has to be deferred back to some other mechanical explanation to give it value, and so we end up with this kind of mechanical model of the world, where everything gets thrown into the, it's a Newtonian in a way, isn't it, in a sense, but everything's thrown into this Newtonian mechanical system. But then we lack the thinking in terms of people like Aristotle. We've just got mechanical causes, but we can't think in terms of teleological causes. We can't think in terms of then, you know, where it might all be going, because all our morals and all our decisions and all the things that we value and our ideals, we talk about, you know, even in evolution itself, of wanting the world to become better, and we might be able to understand this. So implicit within all that is that there is this idea of progress, that there is an ideal that has standalone value, that we're heading towards what philosophers would often talk about, you know, the beautiful, the good, and the true. So you might well have an entirely mechanical system, if you like, or all sorts of mechanics and biology and physics that works in that, but are we confusing the whole building and the architecture and the whole thing that's being built up? Are we just confusing it with the scaffolding? That's probably not a very good metaphor, but do you know what I mean? So yeah, the problem of reductionism, I think, comes up.
Okay. Well, this is a pretty wide-ranging discussion that we're having here, but I don't know. I'm somewhat taking it back to the Toe podcast. You know, for all of the conversation and all the explanation that was had of Matt O'Dowd's ideas, ultimately, I just don't think it was that satisfying a conversation that they had about free will, because it didn't really, aside from him giving his benediction, if I can use that word, his permission for people to believe in the factuality of free will. I don't know what the explanation was. I don't know that anything that he said would change anybody's mind. You know, if they already have a scientific, if they already have a reductionistic view of human behavior. So I wouldn't call it a failure, but I would say that I think it needs more work. And I think if he's going to be talking about free will in his movie, in his documentary, I think he has to work that out in a little more detail. And I think it would be appropriate for him to bring in perhaps people who have thought about free will in its original context, which is the theological context. I mean, it might be scientifically heretical to do so, but you know, maybe he should be bringing in as an expert of some type, somebody who can at least give an historical perspective from a theological angle on the concept of free will, why we even have that concept of free will.
And it's interesting, I think, as well, like in certain religious circles, I think, you know, particularly well, this probably goes across the board, but you get this obsession with libertarian free will. You know, if we haven't got, you know, the belief in libertarian free will, that I could completely, literally have done otherwise, you know, which is never really explained very clearly without, you know, it resulting in some sort of randomness. And I think, you know, I can't think of any decision that we make, you know, except for like the most banal decisions, like say, should I have, I don't know, you know, yellow or blue Jello, you know, and I really have no stronger desire more for one than the other, then I'm kind of like equally torn between the two. In Greek philosophy, I can't remember who it was now, there's a story of Buridan's ass, I think it was, like the donkey, and he dies because he's got two bales of hay he equally desires, and he just about goes to eat from the one, and he's like, oh no, could have that one, no, oh no, could have that one, and then dies because he can't make the choice. You know, there's a kind of mistaken sense that freedom entails that freedom means you have to have a lack of constraint. That sometimes actually through constraints you bring about freedom. You know, and by having a nature and having a certain limited number of things that you could do, you're not paralyzed and you're able to then look at the options, and you have a stronger desire for one thing over another. And you can, I mean, all our decisions, I would suggest, you know, all of our decision making, I mean, forget all the neurons and all the rest of it, just phenomenologically from our known experience is every decision, like if we decided to come on the show today, out of all the other things we could have done, there would have been a kind of inclination or a weighing up in each of us that meant we took this choice or didn't take that choice, you know. And none of us, you know, kind of make choices that are just, we don't make choices that are random. We always pursue some good. We pursue some kind of good. And it's an interesting theological, sorry, I know I'm rambling on here, but theological, philosophical level, in a sense, there's a constant pursuing of the good. So each of our proximate decisions that we make is, in a sense, if you extrapolate it out, a desire or choosing of what the Greeks often called, or the Platonists called, the good. You know, that we're always pursuing towards the horizon of the good.
Well, that's your opinion.
Yeah.
I'm making a joke, but I mean, I can see that the idea of pursuing the good is natural to you. I mean, you know, you're the person who became a degree holder in theology, so of course that type of an idea would have appealed to you. But the person who was a libertarian, a self-described libertarian, which is kind of the antithesis to me. I mean, it's like the last type of an orientation I would choose to have as libertarian myself. You know, if I were a libertarian, I want to pursue what suits me personally. You know, I think, you know, I use a pejorative term, selfish, you know, but
so I mean, I'll be quiet in a second, but I'll just on that note, like Aristotle talks, doesn't he? I think about, you know, like even for any so-called selfish or evil act that we choose, we might have a limited understanding of the good, or we might have sort of narrow blinkers, but none of us gets up in the morning and goes, what evil could I do today, or what really substandard choices could I make? It's just, if we believe something's good, even if it's just being a completely selfish libertine, yeah, but it's that good that appeals to us that we're pursuing, and it is drawing us at the time. And hopefully we might outgrow that and see a wider good, but we're always trying to pursue what we think of as the good. Sorry, Mark. Yeah.
Well, Mark, you must have. You look like you're dying to say something.
I was going to simply say to Rod, there are people who wake up with the intent to do evil. Okay. But
why?
Well, that's fascinating. Why?
Because there's usually a reason. There's some kind of good that they think of.
I happen to agree with you that the reason we make choices is because we want to accomplish something. We have a point, not just a point of view, but a destination we want to get to. So I think you're absolutely correct in that. I think the problem, Al, I think a real big problem we have as Homo sapiens, as human beings at this point, is that we've divorced ourselves from a whole different way of trying to rationalize the environment and the world we're in. That way was the metaphysical way. That way was the way that theology tried to deal with it. Now, in modern days, the theological in this particular civilization, USA and the Western world, has not worked out. I mean, there aren't very many people. I mean, I think, God is dead. We recognize there's no outside force such as that, but there is. It's the universe. It's different energy, but we don't know how to deal with it. See, I believe that we've crippled ourselves in some ways because we have refused to engage in a different way of a different language and a different way of thinking. I think there is something to the spiritual and the metaphysical. That's why I'm not a formal religionist, as you know. I'm probably the biggest atheist, However, I'm an atheist who believes very much in spirituality. But I don't know how. I don't know anyone. I know the Zens and the Buddhists and the others have tried different ways to get to it. But we don't know how to get to it any longer in our Western world. We really do believe that everything comes down to reality. That's why I'm fascinated by his whole idea of what is reality. Reality is, I guess it's what you decide is real. Because if you decide that it's not real to have a spiritual awakening or a spiritual conversation with whatever, yourself, with the world, with the universe, that's somehow loony. That's somehow not proper in our Western world. I think that's wrong. So I think the split, I don't know I know roughly when it happened, but the problem with the science, I think what reason why certain physicists I have an enormous affinity for, I think Graham Greene is one. They what they do is they become metaphysicists rather than scientists when they really get out to thinking about what's happening in this world they don't understand, this quantum world. And I find it fascinating, but I think we've crippled ourselves in some ways by divorcing ourselves from the rightness, what I consider the essential thing we need to have, which is a conversation perhaps with ourselves that deals in the spiritual, that deals in the metaphysical, in the things that, like quantum, are not understandable. They're not necessarily rational in the sense of our rationality, but they are otherwise real and they are otherwise valuable, but we don't know how to get to it any longer. At one time before we developed Newtonian stuff and Newtonian physics, we were there. We were trying to get there. We've virtually abandoned it today. I think, by the way, it's the reason why we have so much angst in our societies today, because there's not enough fulfillment of that element that is part of our human nature. We don't have it any longer. That's unfortunate. And I think it's unfortunate. Now, I don't know whether that means you have to, my sense about free will is very, very simple. I want the ability and the willingness to be open to all, to anything. And I don't care what the anything is. I will sort it out, as Rob has said, on what I think I know to be good and bad. But good and bad has to do with survival. Things that are bad are things that cripple people so they cannot flourish or survive. And I think that that's the only way I know how to develop the morality we're talking about. Morality is a very artificial thing.
The flourishing thing's interesting though, Mark, because there was, I can't remember who it was now, I think it might have been A.N. Whitehead, pointed out, it was quite interesting, he said, well, what's the, we talk in and I totally believe in evolution, so don't get me wrong. I know you have to kind of say that perhaps in an American context with the religious context you have in America, but nothing has greater survival value than non-biological systems, like a rock. You know, it's very likely to survive. It doesn't even need to reproduce itself. It's got high survival value. You know, so you know, if just survival is the end game, then there's no point almost in evolving, because you might as well just stay a rock. The point he made that was quite amusing, but you know, he's exploring obviously the idea that evolution's kind of up to something. And Al and I touched on this last time. I can never get his name right, Al, but Pierre Teilhard, the Chardin de Teilhard, other way around, Chardin, yeah, him.
Pierre Teilhard de Chardin.
Yeah. You know, there's a kind of unfolding directionality to nature. It seems to be getting, as Ken Wilber, the integralist philosopher, talked about, you know, it seems to be getting more complex. You know, we've gone from the very, very simple through to, you know, us having this conversation now, you know. But mere survival not being really worth having. You know, what are we surviving for? You used the word flourish. So the question then, obviously, which the Greeks were really interested in, is like, well, what is the good life? What is the flourishing life? And how do you? Is it just about hedonism? Is it just about happiness? And then you've got morality that comes into it. It's like, what is the good life look like? How should we then live? You know, yeah. I don't know quite where we sparked from earlier there, but it was an interesting point. You know, can you get that answer, that answer to that kind of question you raised, Mark? I guess the question of spirituality. Can we get that answer simply from a mechanical or reductionist science?
I think not. By the way, I think that's part of what we locked ourselves into.
Yeah,
I think we're suffering from some of that, because there's a whole part of our being that needs to have satisfaction in that area. Not necessarily. I have a real problem with people wanting final answers. I don't think there are any final answers. Okay, I think there should be questions that keep coming up and keep moving us forward. But I don't think there's anything that's going to be the final answer. If you want to believe it's God, do it and live by it, and God bless you. But I don't think that's where we as species are going to go.
I mean, that's interesting in itself, because I was listening to Don Hoffman. I don't know if you're aware of Don Hoffman, scientist looking at consciousness at UCL Irvine. And they're doing lots of, sort of mathematics around latest thinking and what they're discovering, and trying to bring together of, you know, what's it called, the cosmic polytope and the amplitudehedron, and kind of the deepest ideas in sort of mathematical physics at the moment, and bringing across, he was just talking about some of that Markovian dynamics as well, but Hoffman's working on a thing called conscious agents theory, which he kind of says ultimately he thinks is kind of somewhat speculative at the moment, but consciousness is the prime substrate, the prime reality underneath everything, and it probably boils down to one single conscious ultimate agent, but that doesn't reduce you down to a simple kind of thing that is a kind of boring kind of like, right now we have all the answers. That he sort of suggests, you know, that whatever that ultimate conscious substrate is itself asking questions, which is why we've got us and the universe doing all this weird funky stuff of asking all these questions, kind of consciousness trying on these VR headsets, if you like. He uses the analogy he uses of going, what would it be like to be a cow? What would it be like to be trying to do this? What would it be like trying to do that? You know, they're working on mathematical modeling of trying to say, look, you know, if we can pull the mathematics together, which they sort of seem to be trying to do, having some success with, I also better get out of that mathematics, the space-time world that we have now of, you know, relativity and quantum mechanics and the theory of evolution and all the rest of it. But, you know, it's kind of brought us into a little bit, maybe, Al, into the second part of Matt's thing, which they start talking about consciousness, don't they, a little bit here and there. But yeah, they're just to come back to that, you know, that maybe whether we call it God or not, you know, an ultimate conscious substrate of all reality might not be a kind of simple full stop end of discussion type thing. It might be, oh, this is an interesting thing, and this is what's it up to, you know? And he says the possibilities are endless with it, even mathematically.
Well, there's my cue to bring in the name of the podcast again. I'm a scientifically oriented person, but I have this view of transcendence imprinted upon me as a child, and as I moved on from dogma and the traditional idea of God, and I basically moved into Bernardo Kastrup and Don Hoffman and their scientific view of consciousness. Basically replaced the concept of God with something that's, secular and non-dogmatic. So I think that Don Hoffman, Bernardo Kastrup, and others should be a source of inspiration to theologians, to people who are talking about the big questions, the big view of reality, including morality, to the extent that there ought to be morality, and I think there ought to be morality. I think it should be informed by the ideas that are coming out of science. And Don Hoffman and his conscious agency theory, I think that deserves to be heard, and it ought to be considered in the context of theology. That's where I'm coming from. That's kind of what I'm trying to bring to the conversation.
But Al, one of the problems is that we keep on saying that we got to get back to what we consider reality, which is material. Material things have overwhelmed our society. People, I think it's pathetic that we believe that the way you're going to achieve satisfaction and happiness is by accumulating things, by having more of everything. Now, what the hell does that really mean when you think in terms of the lifespan of the average Homo sapien? After 100 years, you know what? It doesn't matter.
Well, this is where culture comes in, and language. I mean, reality doesn't necessarily mean material things. I mean,
it does to Americans. Americans particularly have replaced God and the concern about spiritual concerns. All right. And if you will, mind is about that. Mind is the thing that makes consciousness valuable, because what it does is it takes you away from the material matter of the brain. It's something else. It's an energy force, I believe. Now, this is my own crazy, I have no scientific basis for it, but I firmly believe that there is an energy force in the universe, which is the first force. And it, in fact, is part of us, in the sense that we are the most advanced element in that energy force, able to reflect on what that force means, whether it is in our terms, right, wrong, good, or bad. That's why we develop morality. We develop morality largely because we want to survive and flourish. That's why we do it. We don't do it because it's the good that someone has bestowed on us. No. So I believe in this energy force. I think that, well, I don't know whether you know the guy that developed developed a lot of technology.
You talk about Federico Fagin.
talk about Federico Fagan,
Right.
I believe he's on to something. I don't think he's dealing with it in an altogether intelligent, useful way. But I think it's fascinating that he's gone from being a super scientist, super technologist, to the point where he is saying, hey, there's something about the energy in the universe that is not understandable by us, but it is in connection. It connects with us, whether we like it or not. And I found his book to be very, very useful, in the sense that it had a wholly different scientific look at what it means to have meaning in the world and to flourish in the world.
Rob, are you familiar with Federico Fagan?
I've heard the name, but I don't know.
Well, he's a we two are very familiar with Bernardo Kastrup. Bernardo Kastrup is a friend of Federico Fagan. Federico Fagan is an older gentleman who Bernardo feels if Bernardo were to die, his cause would be carried on by Federico Fagan, who he believes embodies the metaphysical ideas that Bernardo was putting forth. And he has a book out that you might find interesting. He is the inventor of the modern microprocessor.
Well, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay. He invented a micro, and he has a memoir out, and he talks about his having had three lives to 4 lives. But his current life, he's moved on from being an inventor and an engineer of computer processors, and now he's investigating scientifically the same things that Bernardo Kastrup is investigating. And it all started with a metaphysical type of experience that he had, where he experienced consciousness as you might be interested in this, something of overwhelming love. And he has a book out. I don't recall the title. Silicone. Okay, that you might. Silicon, right? That you might find interesting. But we've had quite a long conversation here. This might be a good time to wrap it up and maybe look forward to another one, because you're talking about. I mean, maybe I'm doing it prematurely. Rob, you sound like you wanted to say no, but.
Well, no, I was thinking. That sounds a similar journey to Bernardo's, isn't it? And it's interesting seeing these guys that are very, very scientific and very kind of, came from certainly Bernardo came from a place of being convinced that we would be on the verge of creating computers that could be conscious, to undergoing, I think it's Jeffrey Kripal, isn't it? It talks about the flip,
right?
And kind of seeing it the other way around. I was curious with Mark as well, because I wonder, is that what I was wondering when you talk about the energy that you feel underlies everything? Do you feel it's conscious? Do you think it's like, does it connect to consciousness? Is that what it's, or is it just impersonal energy?
No, I think I reverse it. I think consciousness is a reflection of that energy. That's what I think. I mean, I think that the energy in a sense it's not an intelligent thing. It just is what real reality is. And I know that Dowd sort of set aside the string theory. I'm fascinated by the string theory. I don't think it has been adequately sort of explored. But the whole idea of string energy is, if you took matter down to its absolute beginning, it would be simply a matter of energy. It would be simply a matter of, and they call it a string, I don't care what you call it. But if you notice, it's all about pluralities. It's all about pluses and minuses. Whether you make them O's and zeros in computers or whatever you do with it, doesn't matter. What the matter is where the essence of that intelligence and that use is, and it's in energy. And we don't have an adequate, we don't have an adequate understanding of energy. Newtonian physics has locked us into an understanding which is unfortunately too limited. It's locked us away from what I call the spiritual and the metaphysical conversation we were having at one time as human beings. We don't have it any longer. Theology is a farce, as far as I'm concerned. It was a useful effort for 2,000 years to try to converse with this energy force. Didn't work. Okay. I don't think it's working through science, right? I think that's what Federico all of a sudden stumbled upon after he spent 10 years trying to figure out AI. He was trying to figure out artificial intelligence. And what he figured out is it can't happen through our normal physics and our normal science. It has to happen in some other way. He doesn't know what that way is, but he's at least been honest enough to explore it and to be considered a nutcase by other scientists, I'm sure, who figure that he's off the plank. He's basically, but I don't believe that. I believe that we need more intelligent, capable. I was hoping that Dowd would be of that sort, but he's still into his layers of neurons, and he thinks those things are important. And you know what? It's not important. I even have a problem with Noam Chomsky because his linguistics and his generation, his underlying grammar theory is all based on mathematics, which is fine when it deals with language. But it's not fine when you're trying to deal with, if you will, reality. When you're trying to deal with, okay, well, the very thing Rob you said, where are we going for what purpose? What are we doing? I mean, I think there's very little purpose to what we do as human beings in the present. I think, can it be different? Yes.
I was interested as well with...
we won't allow that.
I was interested with Matt O'Dowd as well. One of the things that I was a bit like, I was listening to him thinking that he almost defined consciousness as, he talked about information kind of informing itself. And I thought, but you've misunderstood the idea of what information is. Information has to be known by a knower. Information is just the formatting of the knowledge of the knower. It's not a knower. So the information is like binary bits, for example, can't know other binary bits. Information is just the patterning that a knower has. But I thought he was quite glib in his dismissal of consciousness to some extent there, and of Bernardo. And I found Bernardo I find him a much more thorough thinker, I think. But maybe that's just, he's more philosophical than Matt. Yeah.
Alrighty then. So I think I'm going to wrap this up this time. I think we might have another conversation potential at some point in the future. We'll see if there's interested in that. We've talked about some other people we could talk about. We can talk about Don Hoffman, for example. Rob, you brought up Don Hoffman several times, and I don't know if Federico Fegin has been a guest on TOE. I don't think he has, but if he were to go on TOE, I'd probably want to talk about him as a possibility. But anyway, let me just say thank you very much. It's a Sunday where we have other things that we can do, and I appreciate that you chose to spend some of it with me and with my other friend, and we'll do it again, I hope, sometime in the future. So thank you both very much.
Rob, I really want to say it's a pleasure meeting you, and I really hope we can explore each other's minds and ideas because I think it would be valuable for me. I'm in the process of just learning. I don't know a lot of this stuff. And all I have is raw sort of feelings about inadequacy, I guess is what you can call it. But please let us have another conversation, even if it's in a coffee shop somewhere. We don't have to be in Zoom or anything. But Al, if you want to do it in Zoom, be my guest.
Well, I don't know if you really appreciate Rob's in the UK, so it would be a problem. It'd be difficult.
You guys can buy me an air ticket if you want. That's fine.
It's been an intimate conversation enough that we can share a tea or a coffee or whatever. You know?
Right.
Yeah, no, well, it's good to meet you as well, Mark, and thanks for and thanks, Al, for having me back. So,
and listen, thank you very much also for your persistence, because I was willing to give up earlier today with Mark's connection, and then a miracle, whatever we're going to call it, but everything, once I gave up, everything fixed itself. It took a couple of tries, but everything worked out great. As far as I'm concerned,
something to do with the quantum field, and you as an observer stopping, and as you gave up and stopped observing, there was a sort of collapse of the wave function or something.
Okay, maybe it was the conscious agent at work. I don't know.
Al, it is often what happens in life. At the lowest end is when the answer comes.
Uh-huh.
It's really very true, and I think if we understood it better, we could use it better. But I honestly feel that I think that we used to use a term when I was dealing in electronics. We called zygotes. You know what zygotes are? It's unexplainable events that happen within circuits, and it happened long before we had, all the technology we have now. We always talked about zygotes when we couldn't understand and we couldn't explain, nor could we repair what we had to do in working with very early crude radar and other machinery of that sort. It would happen. And I think it's the part of that energy force we don't understand yet, perhaps.
Okay. All right. Well, lesson learned. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, and we'll chat again. And you guys have each other's email addresses if you want to, keep this going. Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay, Alan.
Thanks again. I do have to go. My voice is just about gone, so appreciate it. Well, there you have it. We've done it twice now. We've had 2 episodes of Raised Catholic Philosophy. I really enjoyed reviewing both of these episodes, especially the second one. I thought we had some pretty good conversation. Myself, maybe not so much, but my guests were brilliant. And if you stuck it out, it's because you thought they were brilliant also. So I'm very, very happy to say we're working on a 3rd episode, another episode based on the same Toe podcast with Matt O'Dowd. We'll try to wrap it up. We'll talk a little bit more about consciousness and other things that we didn't get to talk about in the first 2 episodes. So stay tuned, subscribe, like, maybe spread the word, say something about it in the comments. It'll help me build up an audience, and I appreciate it very, very much. So thanks a lot. See you next time.